You're listening to the Effective Statistician podcast, the weekly podcast with Alexander Schacht and Benjamin Pieske, designed to help you reach your potential, lead great science, and serve patients without becoming overwhelmed by work. Today, I'm talking with Dooti about AI for clinical trials. And there's a really interesting application that probably your study can benefit from as well. So stay tuned. We have a growing community on LinkedIn. So head over to LinkedIn. If you're not signed up there already, then I would strongly recommend that, because that is where others in the industry will find you if you're there. And then find the Effective Statistician group, join there, or follow me on LinkedIn. I'm producing this podcast in association with PSI, a community dedicated to leading and promoting the use of statistics within the healthcare industry for the benefit of patients. Join PSI today to further develop your statistical capabilities with access to the video-on-demand content library, free registration to all PSI webinars, and much, much more. Head over to the PSI website at psiweb.org to learn more about PSI activities and become a PSI member today. Welcome to another episode. Today I'm talking about a really interesting topic, and that is AI. Yeah, another, buzzword that is around all the time. But I think today there's really some, awesome technology, and it's not just a logistic regression that is called AI, but really something that is quite fancy. And for that, I have someone with me who is a statistician in the pharma industry and has actually worked on this specific topic that we want to talk about today. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm very glad to be here.
Very good. So maybe you can start with introducing yourself first.
Absolutely. So to our viewers, my name is Dooti Roy. I'm a statistician who works in this pharmaceutical company called Boehringer Ingelheim. It's a German pharmaceutical company who have many offices around the world. I work in the US Ridgefield office. It's located in Connecticut. I have been at my job now for 5.5 years, and I got a chance and opportunity to work on this really interesting topic. And I'm very excited to share the story with you.
Yeah, awesome. We have actually something in common here, because I have worked at Boehringer as well. Boehringer has this really nice, interesting name that probably no one outside of Germany can actually pronounce if they read it.
We try.
But it's I've worked for it for Boehringer in 2002 to 2004, mainly actually on HIV, which was a very interesting period. But and actually at that point in my career, one of these things that was really interesting and that we had a lot of look into was whether the patients were actually taking these pills. And of course, it's a virus, it's virology. And, in the pandemic now, everybody knows about, how important virology is, and also how important being, adherent to your medication is. Yeah, at that time, I remember that there were lots of discussions about if the patients take the pills, how good is it working? Yeah, and there were even some studies done in patients that are in prison, and where you would, directly observe how they are taking the pill. Yeah, and with these kind of studies, you could actually show that having very good adherence or compliance, had a dramatic effect on the efficacy overall. Yeah, and so one of the drivers of lots of these, failure of the treatment was in essence failure in terms of adherence to the treatment schedule. All kind of different reasons can be for that. Yeah.
And this is exactly the story, I think, in most of the drugs that are being made. I feel that an underlying assumption is always, well, if you take the drug, what can the drug do for you? But if you don't take the drug, no one takes any guarantees, right? That's the underlying message anyway. And I feel that that's a reason why even we went on to collect compliance. However, naively or whatever was adequately available at that point, maybe, but that's the whole reason why you even have that question in your case record forms, right? For a patient that what is the proportion of times a patient took the drug?
Yeah, we had pill counts at that time.
Right, and basically that is the pill counts. Exactly, you're right. So what happens is you just ask the patient, well, can you bring back your empty pill bottle? So if there were like 100 pills before and now you have 50, then you say, okay, the patient has taken 50% of the medication. But whether those 50 pills went inside the patient or went in the garbage bin, you don't know. And that is the challenge. That's the challenge, right? Because before we had no way of following these patients, in their house, in their daily lives, to make sure that we see it with our eyes and confirm on a large scale, right? So for a pharmaceutical company like BI or any other major pharmaceutical companies, they treat like thousands of patients all over the world. It's not operationally feasible to follow each patient around and say, oh, let me check, did you take your drug? So that didn't happen, right? And this is something I came into contact with while working in the CNS area. So I work in the central nervous system, mental health diseases, while in BI. This is basically also an area where the doctors know, in fact, that the patients are not taking their medications regularly. And in some peer-reviewed research, we have seen that they just did a blood test on the patient during their visit to the site, and boom, the blood test shows no trace of drug, but the half-life of the drug is too long. So how can there be no drug? So the doctors know that clearly this patient has been missing and missing doses, and hence why this is more important, because if you're measuring efficacy of a drug and you don't take the drug, how can you then expect the drug to do anything? And we all know in CNS how many trials fail. Actually, most trials fail. This is a funny story. When I started in CNS, one of my seniors in the company told me this. Well, most trials fail. And I told her, well, I was in it for the statistics and the interesting things that you can do there. And if in the way we get a drug, that's great. Right. So this was basically something we were seeing in the past couple of years. And then we got aware of this vendor called AiCure. So what they essentially came and told us was that, well, they have a way of video recording a patient. So they built an app. Right. So the app, what it does is when you are taking a drug, they're going to record your video. And then these videos will get processed through a neural network model to identify or classify you as correctly taken the drug or not. So they can identify if you are the right person, like a facial recognition feature. It can also identify the right pill. So for example, if you're supposed to take an orange oblong pill, and the video captures you taking a black round pill, it will say, sorry, you took the wrong drug.
Okay, that's really cool. So so this is really the topic of the episode today, where we talk about this interesting smartphone app which records this, and it's called AiCure. Really interesting kind of combination of words here, and you'll find actually the link to this in the show notes. So just head over to the effectivestatistician.com, find this episode, and you'll have it there. Or just go to your podcast player and you'll find the details there. So in terms of that, so tell me a little bit more about how you brought that into the company for your work.
Right. So basically, this is not me who brought AiCure to the company. We have actually a clinician who is the project lead for schizophrenia program in BI. His name is Dr. Michael Sand, and he is really a visionary in that sense. So he always knows about what's going on in the field and keeps his hand right on the pulse. So he was
Hmm.
one of the first people to propose that we engage with AiCure. That was probably 3 years ago or so. And then, it was, to be honest, I didn't even know about AiCure very well until 2020 beginning. I was like, okay, there are so many vendors we engage with. This is just another vendor, just some data which is being collected. What's the great about it?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but last year, I was sitting through a meeting, and this was pre-COVID, so people were in the room. Man, there were 20 people in the room, and they were all discussing what data AiCure has been collecting, what kind of trends they can see. And there was one lady from AiCure who made this comment that, we think our data has some predictive abilities. And that got my interest. It was like, what predictive abilities? What do you mean, right? So then they really broke that data down and showed us what the data was doing. So essentially, each and every day they're collecting in some way behavioral data on patient, right?
Yeah.
Some patient are regularly taking their drug right at the time of the alert. Sometimes they just miss the dose. Sometimes they had to be intervened by a site personnel, and then they would get back again. And some people would just not take the dose.
Okay.
So they basically saw that this pattern is quite consistent. It's not like a patient starts being non-adherent and suddenly switches into being adherent if there is no intervention, that is. So for example, I'm a patient who kind of misses 50% of my doses anyway, and I would continue doing that all throughout. So
Okay.
their thought was, well, could we use this early adherence data and predict what the patient's final adherence is going to look like? And this is really important, right? Because in the end, for example, in a phase 3 trial, if your adherence or compliance is too low, many times we would just exclude that patient from the primary analysis, which means you're losing sample size, which
Yeah.
means your power is going to drop,
Yeah.
right? So people care about this stuff. And basically we thought, okay, why not just try out a project, say 3 months projects with a student, and see if this data can actually do something. So that
That's
was the beginning.
interesting.
That was the beginning of my exploration of this AiCure data.
So let's step back for a moment in terms of what AiCure actually does. So
Yes.
it's an app on your phone, and you basically when you include it in your study,
Yes.
and you can then record all kind of different data around it. You can, the typical questionnaire you can embed into this, but you can also use the camera of the smartphone to basically point at your face, with a backwards camera, and then hold the pill in front of this camera, and then show the camera how you're taking it.
Pretty much.
And that is basically, then demonstration of that you have taken it. And then, of course, the time is taken. And if there's, if you haven't taken it, then you get a reminder and all these kind of different things.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I think the AI part of this, so far what you have described is basically a video recording,
Yeah.
right? But I think the interesting part of this, why this is scalable and feasible, is because there is no human review at every video. Because
Yeah.
then again, we are going back the same way, following every patient and checking whether you have taken the dose. So what they essentially brought to the table was this AI model, which essentially processes videos pixel
Yeah.
by pixel and could classify correctly most of the time that whether the patient is taken the dose at the right dose at the right person, right time or not. So
Yeah.
thereby, imagine in a trial, let's say you identify 20% at a time patient population who are not doing what they're supposed to do. So that reduces the site burden, right?
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
can now focus your attention on just those 20% people and say, okay, let me see if I can encourage those patients to follow and be compliant instead, right?
Yeah.
Before, we had no heads up, like who is compliant, who is not, who knows, right? We didn't have any heads up, we didn't know. So the site couldn't focus on those people who actually need help, because we saw in their behavioral pattern that some people, for example, would be compliant, and then just drop off the radar. And now, because the sites are getting these alerts, by the way, this patient is falling off the wagon a little bit, they would give them a call or some sort of intervention and bang the patients back on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the end, this patient has pretty good compliance only because we monitored and intervened at the right time. Instead of basically in a normal situation, you would have no clue. The patient
Yeah.
would just fall off the wagon. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
in some sense, this app has now improved the quality of the data. It has also improved the overall compliance of the trial.
Yeah. And you get these data in real time. Yeah, that's
Yes.
another kind of difference. It's not kind of that you get it a couple of months later, like we used to do with a pill count. Yeah, that patient probably already died or something like this, and then
Hope not. Hope not.
but that it's you wonder about the compliance, but here you get it really directly, and you can directly interfere. Yeah. In a timely fashion, the sites directly see what is happening and can directly get back, call that patient or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And during our project, we basically took this one step further. We were essentially exploring, well, right now that's a situation that you can the sites can real time see which patient is dropping off the radar and follow up with them. But we were more interested in knowing, could we know in advance which patients are going to fall off the radar? Is that possible?
Okay,
Because
the prediction part. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, because in what I understood when I spoke and sort of like spoke to my ClinOps colleagues or the people who were actually in the operational side of the trial management, they said that getting heads up means everything to them.
Yeah.
Because usually this is such a complex machinery around a clinical trial. Immediately doing something is a difficult problem because people would have to allocate resource, plan it out, and then do it. That's how we are used to.
Yeah.
So hence they really appreciated getting sort of like a heads up time when they can strategize and then act, and still it's okay. You're not basically losing out opportunities to act. So basically that's why the predictive piece was very interesting for us, that okay, if we could in fact tell you after observing a patient for a couple of weeks that, by the way, XYZ patients are going to be more at a risk of non-adherent behavior, then you could focus on them from the beginning instead of waiting for them to exhibit such behavior, for example.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was the goal and intent of what we did in the summer. I have to say that this is not really just statistics working. I thought about the project, but there were so many other people, especially the clinical leader and the clinical trial leader. They supported all through.
Yeah.
They were basically very excited about this opportunity, and they didn't think, oh my god, statistics, like what complicated models are you talking about? They were totally on up for it, on it, and was part of the team. So it was a really cool experience.
Yeah, I think the cool thing here is because the benefits were directly tangible to them. It was for them, they don't care about which exact AI model sits in this app. They really don't care. And in terms of the prediction, what kind of prediction model you have actually used, and all these kind of different things that you can do, they really don't care. But what they cared about was your help and the help from the vendor in terms of helping them solve their problems. And so
Pretty much
yeah.
that is very true. I feel that we ended up also using machine learning models for the prediction piece. But that being said, you're right, they don't really care about what model we use, but rather I think the clinical trial leader once told me this, that our goal is to make sure when you build this model, you're not calling bad people good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? If we call good people bad, we don't have too much of a downside, because then just a few extra patients get followed up. However, if we call bad people good, that's a problem, because then we are essentially just like letting the ball drop, right? Some will lose some patients anyway. So essentially, in a model building, you have to optimize the model based on certain criteria, and this became then a criteria. And we could explain back to the clinical team, well, you gave us this feedback, right? So this model specifically cares about whether we are calling bad people good or not, and we try to minimize that. And that was the story. Then how we could like convince them that to use it.
Yes, and that is another kind of very important feature in terms of you need to have a good business background so that you select the best models here. Yeah, it's obviously in this case, the two different arrows have a hugely different impact. One is just having an impact on, it's more burden, whereas the other hand really has an impact on the trial outcome. And so knowing that, and then, selecting your model that optimizes, not just the sum of both errors, but really focuses on the one that counts is really important. So in terms of this app, it could even have an impact on the overall design of the study. Yeah. So I've worked on some CNS studies where we had a so-called blinded placebo run-in. Yeah. So all patients would be on placebo first for an unknown period to them. And only if they were non-responders, they would be randomized. And so here you could also have, something like adherence filter in it, so that you only randomize those patients that will take the medication. And
it's really interesting that you say that, because this is exactly the thing that we are working on right now. When we develop this prediction model, we develop two models. One model, we call it like the early prediction model, which can be actually used precisely for this as a blinded placebo run-in, where you track patients' behavior and you run this model. And if the model says these are going to be adherent patients, you enroll, right? But basically, I think where I saw the struggle from the operational part is, the clinical trial leaders often have to also consider what amount of patients are getting screened versus screen failure, right? So obviously, that implementing a placebo lead-in model is going to, in fact, increase the screen failure rate. Because, ideally, you would have maybe just because based on the inclusion exclusion criteria, you could have left out 20%, 30% people. Now you'll probably be leaving out 50% people. And that's a problem because that extends the timeline. So we had to go back and explain to them how in the end, if you let all patients in, you're anyway going to lose these patients. It's not something that you are losing additional patients. You're just trying to proactively solve the problem which you're going to find in the middle of the trial.
You actually want to use these patients at that point or moment in time. And a higher screen failure rate is here actually something positive. But of course, if you have a culture where everybody thinks about high screen failure is, by definition negative, you need to have a lot more explanation and communication around
Agreed. Basically, there is this operational part to be considered too. Like from our perspective as statisticians, we care about good patients and then make sure that all the endpoint data gets collected right at the time when they're supposed to. However, from the operational perspective, and this is again came out of these innumerable conversations we were having with the people who were involved in the operational part of the trial, that they have to also answer to their bosses about what happened, man. I mean, you are screening people and they're all getting out. Are you not doing a good job, or the trial is taking too long to complete recruitment? I feel that because these concepts are so new, it's not like every other industry in every other company in their trials use AiCure type of screening. So it's also like when you look for examples in the industry, there are none right now. So it's also that way a little jittery from the leader's perspective that should I do this? Would I end up with like too long a trial? Would I be able to even complete the trial? Those kind of questions happen. But hopefully, I think the best part is that during this past year, AiCure became so much more than a vendor to us. I mean, we almost feel like this collaborative research team who meet every couple of weeks and discuss all sorts of problems, and mostly on a theoretical level. And they have the data from other sponsors too. So they can bring insights which, for example, assuage your fears a little bit. Because they can tell us. So one question which the clinician asked was, well, so far the models you have developed is actually on the data which has been collected after randomization. But now you guys are proposing implementing this pre-randomization. How do you know that these two patient behavior is comparable? Right? If we just focus on our data, we have no way of answering that because we haven't done that other part. So, and that's where AiCure came in and said, oh, well, that's not that difficult. We have that data, so we can do this for you. And this is amazing, right? Because there's research questions which can be answered jointly in a much more simpler, concrete fashion as opposed to guessing. Maybe, maybe not. So data is always more convincing than just guesswork, right? So
yeah, absolutely. What I found also really interesting is when I looked into the homepage, and here especially kind of this neuroscience studies are of course of help, is you see the facial expression. And you can also analyze the facial expression. So in terms of feelings of anxiety, depression, pain, these type of things. And they are, common things that you look into when you look into neuroscience studies. Maybe, at one point that becomes also as an additional endpoint that you can actually see much more on the face, like how is the patient doing. And so maybe that's another future for these kind of really AI-driven analysis.
I totally agree. Actually, now that you mentioned, I was working in some oncology trials in the beginning of my career, and then there was this questionnaire called drug acceptability questionnaire, right? So you would basically ask people, did you have difficulty swallowing? How did it taste? Was it pleasant, etc. But I was thinking that if similar things you can directly observe from the patient's face. Right.
Yeah.
So that's definitely possible. That is does not sound like a huge stretch of imagination to make it happen. That's true. I think the other interesting piece which this opportunity brought to the table was also the concept of ongoing monitoring. So we were thinking, well, fine, we now know that first couple of weeks of data can predict the how the end total average adherence is going to be. That's great. But in fact, AiCure gives you daily data. Every day of the trial the patient is in, you get the data. So why even stop with just first 2 weeks, right? What could we do more with the rest of the data that's being collected regularly? And we came up with this ongoing monitoring. I mean, in the trial, ongoing monitoring is always a thing, right? You have these review meetings where people review data, but that's only every 3 months. Right. So we were thinking, well, we have to move away from this every 3 months, every 4 months model and look at as frequently as possible. Obviously, reviewing every day is not something where you have time or resource for, but something more frequently than every 3 months. Right. So thereby we came up with the idea of building an app around it. Right. So why not just have an app which can be hosted on a domain and at any time point has the latest information related to a trial's adherence data. You just need to click it once, it'll refresh and you can see how your patients are doing. So that also was a really interesting bit of work because this needed a lot of feedback from our end users, which is basically the clinical trial monitors and leaders, because they don't understand what's going on with these complicated models. So we had to work with them that what is important to you? What would you like to know? What would you like to know first? What would you like to know second? And that whole iterative process of developing that app was also really, really cool because it kind of gives an insight into what is important to the other person. Maybe the things we would notice first is not something they would care about first, So now that app is also in place and we were basically encouraging all trials in this domain who has access to AiCure data to also use the app and make sure that, you can regularly get an understanding how your patients are doing.
That is really a good point. It actually links back to an earlier episode where I interviewed Steve Pike from GSK. And these type of analysis, one of the topics that he asks statisticians to have a much more dive into all the operational aspects of clinical trials, because there is so much improvement possible in terms of timelines, which directly increases the speed to which you get the patients, the treatments to the patients, as well as reducing costs and burden around the clinical trials. Yeah, if you need to have an intervention only on 10% of your patients in terms of monitoring, then all the patients, that makes a huge difference. Yeah, and that you can very easily probably pay a couple of additional statisticians from this money that you save there. So it's
yeah, we are cheap.
Yeah, we are really cheap compared to the overall thing. Completely agree. Yeah, it's when I entered the industry, and it's probably now more extreme. Some of my new supervisors said to me, 90% of the internal costs for studies, so only the internal ones. Yeah, not talking about paying the physicians to actually do those studies. The internal cost, 90% of that is operations, clinical operations. Of the rest, 10%, 90% is data management. And then the rest is statistics, medical writing, and all the other things. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised at this information. I also feel that we don't add that much of a cost burden as opposed to the whole trial where you spend millions and millions of dollars on these sites and getting the patients, etc. I think the other piece which AiCure makes it attractive for patients is this reimbursement factor. They have this thing called micro reimbursement for patients. So they kind of try to incentivize patients to use the app. Because usually what happens in at least in our trials, use of this app is kind of patient dependent. A patient might want to say, no, I don't want to use this app. And then there is no reinforcement that, no, you have to use it, right? So you have to care about what they think. If someone doesn't want to use it, how do you make them, no, you have to. So with this added incentives, maybe the patients find it easier. I think we were very pleasantly surprised in our trials where we see that majority patient actually, and by majority, I mean 85, 90% patients without any being even told, they would like, oh, your app is completely fine. And it also tells you in today's day and age, apps have become so integrated to our lives, right? I mean, from the time we wake up to the time we go to the gym to we go to bed, apps are everywhere. And it's not such a big deal. It doesn't add to the patient burden as opposed to like doing another battery of tests, which might take 3 hours of the patient's time.
Yeah, completely agree. If you look into these kind of standard tests for depression or schizophrenia or quality of life, you have lots of questions that you need to answer. And if you would do that on a daily basis, that would be a lot of dropouts just because people don't want to fill in anymore these questionnaires. So I think that's a really important part that you can probably do much easier.
Because let's be honest, right? I mean, if someone told me you have to fill like 3 hours worth of questionnaires every day, I'm like, I'm out. I really, who wants to, right? Because many of these patients, they have their personal life too. They go to work. They're people who have 20 other things to do. In the middle, they're also trying to make time for themselves and take care of themselves. Hence, they're in a trial. But if that trial becomes everything, many people would be like, this is too much, right? And one of the reasons, I think this is something of a learning for me, because when I came into this industry new after PhD, I always thought, why can't we just get data? What is the problem, right?
Yeah.
and I remember before working on a particular project, my TMM again, he's kind of like a mentor to me in some sense.
By the way, TMM is the BI abbreviation
the team member
for
medicine.
the medical lead. Yeah.
Medical lead, exactly. So he invited me to come and attend sort of like a workshop where we essentially went through what a patient would go through in a typical day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in 2 hours, I was exhausted. I'm like, oh my God, are you telling me I have to do still 10 more of these? It's a lot. So I think these kind of exercises really helps bridge the gap between, us, because I feel that statisticians, we always think in averages and summaries.
Yeah.
We are like, what is one patient? Give me like 20, 30, then we'll talk. But the individual patient existence and their experience, that's one way to connect us to that. And that was really interesting and useful
Yeah. Yeah.
to connect
Completely
to that
agree.
piece.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now we can think, I'm like, oh, is this too many questionnaire? Is this going to take too long? What about the patient burden? And these kind of questions also helps bridge the gap between statisticians and clinicians, because they are also thinking in the similar line, right?
Yeah. I
So
think in terms of these apps, I would foresee that they would be probably used outside of clinical trials at some point as well. Because, for example, insurance companies are really interested that the drugs that they pay are also taken. Yeah, because paying for a drug or that is not taken is just waste for them. Yeah, so I could think of that. Patients that use these apps, yeah, and where they demonstrate their adherence to medication, actually pay less for their insurance, for example. Yeah.
right. I think this was also a question which has been coming up a lot because, we have been talking about implementing this placebo lead-in and these kind of selection of patients based on that data. So hence, obviously, people are asking what is the regulatory implication? What
Yeah.
will happen to the patient access? I think our opinion right now is that we have to be very careful that we are not essentially putting up walls for patients to access
Yeah.
the drug, right? The idea is not to prevent patients from accessing the drug, rather to help them get the best out of the drug. And
Yeah.
simultaneously, the insurance companies are happier because now the drugs are actually being taken, and
Yeah.
then they should function as they have promised to, because now we're talking about approved products, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is I think very important. Like we have to make sure that it is not about restricting access, it's just about managing the access better.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely agree. That was an awesome discussion about how AI can change healthcare, how AI can challenge how we run clinical studies. And it just started out with how could we improve, from pill counting and what we did for decades. And now that we have everybody has these smartphones in their pockets, which we didn't have 20 years ago when I was doing these kind of studies. It's really, really awesome and lots of opportunity. And if you want to find out more about this, just head over to the effectivestatistician.com and search for Dooti's name. That's probably the easiest way. Then you'll find this episode and also a link to the corresponding homepage. Thanks so much. Any final things that you would like to have the listener as a key takeaway?
Thank you, Alexander, first of all, for hosting me. I think this was really interesting chatting with you. I think the key takeaway for me, which I would like to share with our audiences too, is think outside the box, right? So basically, just because something has been done for years and ages doesn't mean that's always the right thing to do. Also, I think the other important thing is when you try to convince people that you may have an idea which is worth pursuing, don't always say that my idea is better, but rather try to demonstrate it to some data or some comparison, because numbers we understand, right?
Yeah.
You can compare, you can show that, look, this is how it is beneficial, this is how it's better. And that's a much better way of approaching a problem rather than saying, I know it's better.
Yeah.
Right. So that would be essentially the, and I hope that we find many more use cases of this kind of application. I'm sure in the future we'll see many other companies like AiCure prop up. This is just the first one. But I do see that this is the future of patient adherence tracking. I don't think anyone would be satisfied with pill counts once you know the kind of information and insight you can gather from using apps like this one.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just an app. It's not something like, you need a complete new device for it. That's a cool thing.
It's not going to change your world. It's just going to change the way we, collect and interpret the data. That's it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This show was created in association with PSI. Thanks to Rain, who helps with the show in the background, and thank you for listening. Please visit theeffectivestatistician.com. There you will find the show notes and learn more about our podcast to boost your career as a statistician in the health sector. If you like this podcast, then please tell your colleagues about it, and you'll find other listeners of this podcast in our LinkedIn community. Reach your potential, lead great science, and serve patients. Just be an effective statistician.